giving talks that people think are reading. So I should say at the outset that my philosophy is that one really should present, and it's useful for people to understand and get an unvarnished view of what the policy and the political landscape really looks like. If there are things that you hear and are about to discuss that you think are not the way you think the policies should come out, obviously, a lot of them I'm going to talk about the things where I would like to see the policy take a very different direction. But it seems to me that one can't formulate the most effective strategies or do the most effective analysis unless one is honest with oneself and one's colleagues about how grim the challenges actually are. So that's what I'm going to talk about. In essence, the issue is, or the challenge is the intersection of two very big top issues. The first, you all know about, is that the fiscal policy path, that is the budget path the federal government is on, is not sustainable. If it isn't changed, ultimately there will be some significant damage to the economy. What the chart shows is that no changes in policy at all are made. All the Bush tax cuts are made permanent. There are no changes in Medicare, Social Security, the healthcare system, and anything else. Then ultimately the deficit, federal budget deficit, which is the amount above that black line, the black line are tax revenues, grows and grows and reaches dangerous levels. How do we know it reaches dangerous levels? Because what it translates into is federal debt as a share of the economy, as a share of GDP, the gross domestic product, absolutely exploding in future decades. And this is definitely not a sustainable situation, not one that financial markets would well tolerate, and there would be significant damage to the U.S. economy. However, there's also a second set of issues where the trends are grim. On September 13th, the Census Bureau released its annual figures on poverty and income in the United States. When you just go down that list, it's one bad piece of news after another. The share of people living in poverty reached 15%, 51%, share of children 22%. Those are the highest levels since '93. The number of people in poverty, 46.2 million, is the largest on record. The two that I highlighted, I find particularly appalling. The share of people with cash income below half the poverty line reached the highest level on record. That data go back several decades. There were 20.5 million Americans living below half the poverty line in terms of their cash income in 2010. That's below about $11,000 a year for a family of three, and about $5,700 a year for a single individual. Accompanying the increase in poverty, we have a long-term trend of rising inequality where the gains from economic growth are not evenly shared. If you look at the 3 decades after World War II, from the mid-40s to the mid-70s, the rising tide pretty much did lift all boats in the aggregate. You look at the bottom fifth of the population, the middle fifth of the population, the top fifth of the population. They all grew, and the top fifth or the top 1% did not have their income grow at a much faster rate than everybody else. But something changed in the 70s. These are primarily factors in the economy. And so for the years for which we have the best data, 79 to 07, you see this dramatic increase in inequality in after-tax income. Now, we do have some census data for the period since 2007, and it just aggravates the situation. Everybody lost ground, but the lower your income group, the more ground on average you lost. So to go back to our first slide, the question is, how do we address this problem? There's a famous saying from the former economist, the late Greenstein, that if something can't continue forever, it won't. This isn't going to go on. It's unsustainable. There are going to be big policy changes one way or the other. Well, how do we address these budget problems without decimating the safety net, plunging millions more people into poverty, and making those figures even worse than they already are? How do we do it without making inequality already at the highest level since the 1920s worse? Well, a starting point is to avoid the simplistic and ultimately misleading claim that the entire budgetary problem is a problem of spending and therefore we should solve it entirely with budget cuts, with no revenue contribution. People who argue that point in particular to the light blue wedge, the second from the bottom. They say, see the rising costs of Medicare and Medicaid, we have to hit them hard. Now, apart from the problem, which I'll get to more in a minute, that what drives that light blue wedge is nothing particular to Medicare or Medicaid. It is the aging of the population. Old people have something like 5 to 8 times the average annual health care costs of younger people. So as the population ages and more people are eligible for Medicare, the costs go up. And secondly, health care costs throughout the U.S. healthcare system, not just in Medicare and Medicaid, are rising. We have an inefficient healthcare system, but the increase in cost is to a significant degree driven by medical advances. Do we not want medical advances that prolong life and improve health? So it's very difficult. But beyond that, the argument that the problem is entirely because of increases in costs for government programs completely misses a fundamental fact. And the fundamental fact is that in 2001, that's only 10 years ago, in 2001, both the Congressional Budget Office, the Office of Management Budget, the Federal Reserve, private forecasters, all forecast federal budget surpluses for as far as the eye could see, for decades to come. Alan Greenstein testified before Congress that his biggest concern was that we'd have run such big surpluses that we'd pay off the national debt and the government would have to use its surplus to start buying into private industry, and that wouldn't be good for the private economy. They were worried about surplus. Now, when the budget forecasts were done in 2001, everybody knew the ages of all Americans alive. We knew the population was aging. It was built into the forecast. We knew that healthcare costs were rising faster than the economy was growing. It had been going on for 20 to 30 years. We knew those things, and yet we still forecast budget surpluses. What happened? Well, basically, you see the black line at the very bottom, there's a little white space around 2016. What it tells you is if it weren't for these 5 factors, the budget would be in balance every year for the next 10 years, except 2016, when we'd have a tiny deficit. Those 5 factors caused a dramatic change in the outlook since 2001. And you see the really biggest wedge, the Bush-era tax cuts. Now, you may ask, if the Bush-era tax cuts are the same now as they were X years ago, 5 years ago, why does the cost of that grow so much over time? So to answer that question, we have to go back to this chart. See the wedge at the top called interest. So what happens is each year that we run a deficit, the amount of the deficit gets added to the debt. So then we have a larger amount of debt we have to pay interest on. If the deficit is small enough that the debt doesn't grow faster than the economy does, we can deal with it. But if the deficits get bigger and bigger and bigger, then the interest payments get larger each year, and the interest payments are an expenditure, so it's like feedback. That then makes the deficit even larger. So what happens here is the interest payments explode. And the interest payments are a derivative. If you increase a program without covering the cost and you increase the deficit, interest goes up. If you cut taxes without covering the cost and you increase the deficit, interest goes up. So what's going on here is that with each passing year that the Bush tax cuts are in effect, they cumulatively have more deficits, and so the impact on the interest costs on the debt, interest payments on the debt, gets bigger and bigger and bigger with each passing year. Did you have a question? Did you have oh, sorry, I thought you were raising your hand. So, adding to our problem is, as I mentioned here, the big increase in program costs, Medicare and Medicaid, as distinguished from interest payment costs. Interest payments on a program you can't decide not to pay them. The big increase in Medicare and Medicaid costs is not because there's something inherently wrong in Medicare or Medicaid that we can just readily fix. In fact, Medicaid costs much less per person than private sector health insurance because it pays healthcare providers less, it has lower marketing costs, and it has no profits. And healthcare costs in Medicare and Medicaid for 30 years have generally simply been rising at about the same rate as private sector healthcare costs. In the last decade, they've actually been rising a little more slowly. The conclusion most analysts have drawn is that there are real limits to how much saving you can get out of Medicare and Medicaid without impeding access of low-income people to care, increasing the ranks of the uninsured, increasing the ranks of the underinsured, unless you're able to reform the entire U.S. healthcare system and slow the rate of growth in healthcare costs system-wide. You do not have to be a big liberal to come to that conclusion. The first quote is from David Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States, super deficit hawk, and the part that I've highlighted is really the key. Medicare and Medicaid cannot grow over the longer rate at a slower rate than cost of the rest of the healthcare system without resulting in a two-tier healthcare system. What does he mean by a two-tier healthcare system? Basically that you ration care on the basis of income. People on Medicare who are affluent can supplement it, are fine, but that Medicare and Medicaid squeeze down what they provide so much each year that over time advances in medicine that are available to people who can pay for it are not available to lower income people who are more dependent upon these programs. Now, this leads, if you look at the second highlighted part from Peter Orszag, to the need to restrain overall healthcare costs. And we started down that road with the health reform law, the Affordable Care Act. But the unfortunate reality is we don't really yet know all the things to do, or that much to do, of how to slow the rate of growth in healthcare costs system-wide without compromising the quality of care. The Affordable Care Act, the health reform law, sets up all kinds of pilots and demonstrations and research to find ways to do that. But it's going to take a number of years till we begin to get the answers. So to sort of wrap up the healthcare part of this discussion, on the one hand, the largest factor behind the long-term budget forecast is the rising cost of Medicare and Medicaid, but they really just reflect the rising costs throughout the U.S. healthcare system and the aging of the population. And in order to achieve savings there without getting to a two-tier healthcare system and really compromising care for older people who can't afford it and lower-income people, we need to reform the overall healthcare system, which will take time. So that leads to a conundrum. We've got a bit of a bipartisan, there isn't much we have a bipartisan consensus on in Washington these days, but we have a bit of a bipartisan consensus that we need about $4 trillion in deficit reduction over the coming decade. That's about the amount it would take to reduce the deficit to a size where the debt does not grow faster than the economy, and therefore you go all the way back. You don't have an upward curve. The dark blue just stays flat. So we need $4 trillion. Now, an even related issue to all these issues in home care is the fact that, although it's not often mentioned, we really also have a bipartisan consensus in Washington that over the next 10 years, the period the $4 trillion is sought for, over the next 10 years, there will not be significant deficit reduction savings in Social Security or Medicare. Now, that may seem surprising from reading the headlines, for me to say there's a bipartisan consensus on that, but there is. Both parties agree that we're not going to do big cuts in benefits for current elderly beneficiaries of Social Security and Medicare. The most far to the right budget, with the deepest budget cuts ever to pass a Chamber of Congress, was Paul Ryan's budget that the House passed this April. The budget cuts, as I'll explain shortly, are draconian. How much does Ryan cut from Social Security? 0. What about Medicare? You've heard of this huge controversial Medicare voucher plan, which I'm not going to talk about today, but I think is very bad policy. Yet, for the first 10 years, his budget saves very little in Medicare. As I said, there's a consensus you don't apply these changes to current elderly retirees. The controversial Ryan voucher, Medicare voucher plan doesn't take effect until the second decade, and then starts to phase in gradually. Okay. Let's do the math. We need $4 trillion. We're not going to get big savings in the first 10 years from Social Security or Medicare. Over time, we need big reforms in the healthcare system that enable us to get significant savings in Medicare and Medicaid, but that's not going to happen. There's some in the first 10 years. It's not big. So what should we do? How do we get there from here? Interestingly enough, one of the first people to write about this and to publish a major column on it in the Wall Street Journal was none other than Martin Feldstein. Martin Feldstein is a conservative Harvard economist who for a while was chairman of President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. And Feldstein said, essentially, given that it's going to take time to get savings out of programs like Medicare and Social Security, and that we need to act now to stabilize the debt so it doesn't rise faster than the economy grows, what we ought to do is let all of the Bush tax cuts expire. Not just those for people over $250,000 a year, all of them. Well, what would that do? Well, in fact, it would do a lot. To reduce the deficit to the point where the debt is stable as a share of the economy, you need to get deficits down to roughly 2.8% of GDP. Simply letting all the Bush tax cuts expire would get us most of the way there in the coming decade. People are often surprised to hear how huge in cost the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts, are. So the total cost of those tax cuts over 75 years would equal a little under 2% of the size of the economy over 75 years. Well, the Social Security shortfall that we all hear a great deal about is about 0.7% of GDP over 75 years. In other words, the cost of the Bush tax cuts is about 2.5 times the entire Social Security shortfall over the next 75 years. Also, people are often surprised by how big the Bush tax cuts are for people at the top of the income scale. Now, I'm about to show you a slide, and when I have shown it in the past, people's first assumption is that the figures you're about to see are the size of the tax cuts over 10 years, 10 annual tax cuts combined. No. I'm about to show you the 1 year amount, the amount of people in different income groups on average get each year from the Bush tax cuts. This is from the Brookings Urban Tax Policy Center. If you make over $1 million a year, your average tax cut is $130,000 a year. A year. Now, as I noted, the Feldstein recommendation, which people like Peter Orszag and our center very much endorsed, is not just to let the Bush tax cuts expire for people at the top of the income scale, but for everybody. Despite rhetoric to the contrary, for middle-income families, the median family, right in the middle of the income scale, actually, federal income tax rates are quite low. But, as probably everybody in the room knows, everything I've talked about for the last 3 or 4 minutes has zero political reality. Right? What are the chances that all of the Bush tax cuts are going to expire? Zero. How many Republicans in Congress could you name in favor of that? Zero. How many Democrats who at least would publicly admit to favoring letting all the Bush tax cuts expire? I can name about 5. Even the president's proposal to let the tax cuts for people over $250,000 a year expire has, at best, a 50-50 chance, and maybe less than. So let's do the math again. We need $4 trillion. We're not going to get big savings out of Social Security. We'll get some out of Medicare, not real big in the first 10 years. There's a wall of opposition to raising that, even for people getting that size tax. If you need those deficit reduction amounts, you can't get much or anything out of Social Security, little out of Medicare, and there's political opposition on taxes. What happens? Well, in that environment, 2 parts of the budget become especially vulnerable. The first of the 2 are what we call appropriated or discretionary programs. These are the programs that are not entitlement programs. The programs whose funding is determined every year in the annual appropriations bill. It doesn't take much for me to demonstrate that that's one of the most politically vulnerable categories. Look at the outcome in August last month on the debt ceiling showdown. The one part of the budget that was cut was discretionary programs. They were cut nearly $1 trillion over the coming 10 years. This is the part of the budget that really has all basic government operations in it. Most education, low-income housing, environmental protection, clean food and water, Head Start, scientific research. Actually, nearly all of the things that economists rate as public investments that have the potential to improve future productivity growth. Education, job training, infrastructure, basic scientific research, those are all in the discretionary, the appropriated part of the budget, either in full or in large part. This is one of the 2 parts that becomes most vulnerable given the budgetary realities on the front. What's the other part that's most vulnerable? Core programs for low income. Here's the Ryan budget, passed the House of Representatives in April of this year. It is the most extraordinary budget I've ever seen in decades of working on budget. It gets nearly 2/3 of all of its budget cuts in the first 10 years from programs targeted on people with low incomes. It's difficult, even for me, in the work that I do, to comprehend the enormity of the budget cuts and programs for the poor in the Ryan budget. The Medicaid cuts alone are $1.4 trillion over 10 years. If I take a program like, I'm an old fogey, I still can't stop calling it food stamps. It's now called the SNAP program, but I still can't. You changed the name. So once in a prior incarnation, it seems like it was so long ago, I ran the program in the Carter administration. And we had pretty big battles over the food stamp program in those days. I'm proud to say that one of your, meaning North Carolina senators, actually for a while devoted effort to trying to get President Carter to fire me. I was not Jesse Helms' favorite person in writing food stamp program. Thought I was adding too many low-income people to the program. After Carter was defeated and Reagan came in, it was clear there were going to be cuts in food stamps, and there was a debate over the magnitude of the cuts. Now, Bob Dole, who was my ally, and whom I have great admiration for to this day, the Republican leader Bob Dole really didn't want there to be cuts in food stamps. Ronald Reagan proposed cuts of $2 billion in food stamp benefits over 5 years. Jesse Helms pushed, he was the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, for $4.5 billion in benefit cuts in food stamps for poor people over 5 years. Now, I know that a dollar today isn't worth the same as a dollar in 1981 when we were having this fight. But even after you adjust it, the Ryan budget cuts food stamps $127 billion over 10 years. It's almost unfathomable. These kinds of decisions have very large impacts on poverty. These are from the census data. So we see that in 2010, unemployment insurance program, for example, kept a little over 3 million people out of poverty. When we use, as analysts favor doing, a broader measure of poverty that counts things like food stamps and housing subsidies, and the tax credits like the earned income credit is income and subtracts out payroll taxes and things of that sort. You see that the earned income credit, a key tax credit for the working poor, lifted 5.4 million people out of poverty. Food stamps lifted nearly 4 million people out of poverty. You do big cuts in these programs, you get big increases in poverty. Moreover, let me go back to a point I mentioned earlier when we were looking at the poverty data, namely that the number and percentage of people living below half the poverty line is now at the highest levels we have on record, going back to the mid-70s. This is the same story graphically. Well, why did this occur? Now, of course, it's exacerbated right now by the downturn, the recession. But there are other factors as well related to changes in government policy. So this slide, I think, is pretty interesting. It tells you that in 1995, there were 9.2 million children in families whose income was below half the poverty line before you took into account benefits they got from means-tested programs, that is to say, federal programs targeted on people with low income. After you took those benefits into account, only 1.4 million of those children remained below half the poverty line. A lot of them were still poor, but they weren't below half the poverty line. Okay. Now, in 2005, the number of children whose families had income before government benefits below half the poverty line was 3 million fewer than in 95. Yet at the end of the day, the actual number was 1 million greater, because the programs, the low-income programs, lifted many fewer children from below half the poverty line to above half the poverty line than they'd been doing a decade earlier. Why? Well, there was general agreement in the mid-90s that we had a somewhat dysfunctional welfare system, and it was changed. And in the hot economy of the late 90s, when the unemployment rate went down to 4%, and a lot of people were able to find jobs, there was celebration that the welfare changes were a great success. What we now see is we had one system that was dysfunctional in some ways replaced by another system that's dysfunctional in other ways. So look at this figure. There used to be, depending on the year, 79, 96, 68 to 80 for every 100 families with children who were in poverty. Somewhere between 2/3 and 4/5 received benefits through the old program, AFTC, that preceded welfare reform. And now, for every 100 families with children in poverty, only 27 get any assistance. The benefit levels have also been cut in that program, and so the result is that many, many fewer children who otherwise would have been in deep poverty, only about 1/3 as many, are now lifted out of deep poverty. Now, this is particularly relevant because, to come back to my slide about the Ryan budget, the answer to the question of how does he get $127 billion in savings in food stamps? How does he get the massive savings in Medicaid? Is he basically says, the 96 welfare law was such a stunning success that we're going to replicate it in Medicaid and in food stamps. We're going to end them as entitlements. We're going to convert them to fixed block grant amounts. We're going to set the funding level far below where it otherwise would be. And we're going to design it so that, unlike under the current system, where when unemployment rises and poverty increases and more people qualify for Medicaid and food stamps, they are served. They are entitled to benefits if they meet the eligibility criteria because they've lost their jobs and become poor, but under a block grant, funding level doesn't go up when the economy goes down and nobody's entitled to anything. And if you set rules like that, you can get pretty massive savings. So this is a pretty grim picture, but there are at least two glimmers of hope. Glimmer number one. I'm going back to Martin Feldstein. I'm kind of amazed at many issues. I don't agree with Marty on this, how much I'm citing him. Feldstein has noted that the tax code is filled with what analysts call tax expenditures. Alan Greenstein once called them tax entitlements. Credits, deductions, preferential rates, exclusions, all sorts of features like that. And Feldstein and others are trying to convince some anti-tax Republicans that these provisions actually represent spending. It's just in the tax code, and they should be willing to secure deficit reduction by reducing spending here. Well, how much money is there? Well, really quite a lot. So there's about $1 trillion a year in lost revenue due to these tax expenditures. Now, they include very popular things like the mortgage interest deduction. They're not easy to touch. But when you compare them, they're more than everything we spend on defense, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're more than all non-defense, non-entitlement programs. They cost more than Medicare and Medicaid combined, and more than Social Security. We're beginning to get a little movement in some quarters on the tax expenditure. The report of the commission chaired by Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson actually sought to get $1 trillion over 10 years of deficit reduction through curves in tax expenditures, and it did get 3 Republican senators to vote for it. You know, when you think about tax expenditures, it becomes easier to think about them when you move from the abstract to the concrete. So, for example, let's take, here we are at a university. College is expensive. I don't know what the tuition is at Duke. I'm sure it's not much. So we have all sorts of federal programs that help to subsidize the cost of higher education. If you're from a low-income background, maybe you have a Pell Grant. It's not a loan, it's a grant. evidence is pretty clear that in the absence of Pell Grants, many students from low-income backgrounds either couldn't afford to go to college or couldn't afford to stay. But we also have big tax breaks for the costs of higher education, some of which, doesn't matter how high your income is, you can still get them by 529. Now, the evidence is also pretty clear there. Most people who use 529 accounts to build up these tax-sheltered savings they then use to help pay the costs when their kids go to college. If you didn't have the 529 account, would their kids not go to college? The effect there would be virtually zero. These are people who see the value of college, they could afford it anyway. There's a tax break, they're going to take advantage of it, but the impact on whether people do or don't go to college is near zero. The impact on Pell Grants is quite substantial. Also, if you believe that while we should enforce equality of outcomes, we should have equality of opportunity, that if you have the ability to do really well in college, you shouldn't even not be allowed to go because you can't afford to pay the tuition because your parents are poor. But if you're in a world where spending cuts are legitimate, but tax increases are ruled out for deficit reduction, it means, yes, we can cut Pell Grants, but we can't touch 529 accounts. That's what the Ryan budget does. It cuts Pell Grants down $100 billion over the next 10 years. Another example is child care. If you're a low-income mother and you have a minimum wage or low-wage job, particularly if you're a single mother, you may not be able to actually go to the job unless you get help with child care costs. There are federal programs that work through the states that either provide the mother a subsidy or they cover part of the cost directly to the child care center. Those are spending programs. If you're middle income, upper middle income, or upper income, you get a federal child care subsidy too, but you get it through the dependent care tax credit. You make $5 million a year, but if you have a child care cost, you can get the dependent care tax credit. Now, for the high income people, they wouldn't work if they didn't get their dependent care tax credit. Nonsense. But for some of these low income mothers, either they couldn't work or they'd have so little money left after paying for child care that they couldn't afford things like paying the rent that goes for their kids, and they didn't get help with the child care cost. But if we're in a world where you can only talk about spending cuts and you can't talk about tax increases, we can cut child care, and we're doing that in the budgets that are starting to roll out in the appropriations bills. We can cut child care support for low-income working mothers, but you don't touch it for people on high-income levels because that's a tax increase. So, and this is really what Feldstein and others are talking about here. You want to talk about the federal government needs to save some money in higher education subsidies or the child care subsidies. You have to have all the subsidies on the table. You shouldn't be rolling some out just because they're in the tax code, particularly when those are the least effective in terms of achieving their desired result, because the people could afford to do the desired behavior anyway, going to college, going to work. So the one glimmer of hope is we're at least starting to have the beginning of this discussion about tax expenditures. And the second glimmer of hope, which I'll talk more about in a minute, is that we do have a tradition. It's not the only tradition, but there's a thread which we saw in the 1990, 1993, and 1997 deficit reduction packages, all three of which, indeed, were designed in ways that they did not increase poverty or widen inequality. Actually, all three of them reduced poverty. Two of them increased the earned income credit. One of them created the children's health insurance program, even as they reduced deficits overall. So the notion of doing deficit reduction in a way that protects people at the bottom of the income scale is not alien from American political culture. It's happened in the past. On the other hand, we have a second tradition tradition, which isn't so pretty, and we saw that in 1981, the first Reagan year, and 95-96 with the Gingrich Congress, where Republicans sought out to do big budget cuts. Early on, they trotted into the waters of big cuts in Social Security in one year, Medicare in another. They paid a political price. They retreated on Social Security and Medicare and smashed programs for low-income people. We have that tradition too. So, which path are we going to take? Well, that brings me to the final part of the talk, which is, if your view is that we really ought to take a path in which everything is on the table, including revenue, and that we should set a goal as a nation that we shouldn't do deficit reduction in a way that increases poverty and widens inequality, then what could be the role for philanthropy? What is philanthropy? Well, I think the first issue I think of in terms of the role of philanthropy is the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. It's actually not only possible, but there's a considerable potential that organized philanthropy will do. Why? Well, one of the tax expenditures is the itemized deduction for charitable contributions. So there's been a lot of discussion of how do we help reduce the deficit by reducing tax expenditures, particularly among high-income people. And President Obama has proposed capping the value of a variety of tax expenditures, including but not limited to itemized deductions, at 28%. Let me explain. If you're in the 15% income tax bracket, maybe you make, I don't know, $60,000 a year, whether it's your charitable deduction, mortgage interest deduction, if you itemize deductions, and the average person at that level doesn't even itemize deductions, they take the standard deduction. But if you itemize deductions, then each dollar of deductible expenses reduces your income tax by 15 cents. If you're upper middle class and you're farther up the income scale and you're in the 28% marginal income tax bracket, each dollar of deductible expenses reduces your taxes 28%. If you're in the top bracket, each dollar reduces your expenses 35 cents. So a wealthy banker who has a multi-million-dollar mansion is able to get a much bigger mortgage interest deduction, both because his mortgage is bigger, but also gets 35, the government basically subsidizes 35 cents of every dollar of his mortgage interest payments. Whereas for the guy in the 15% bracket, the carpenter, the plumber, the school teacher, whoever, the government's subsidizing 15 cents of their mortgage interest rate. So the president said, well, if you're in a bracket above 28%, you should still only get 28 cents on the dollar on your itemized deductions and certain other tax breaks. This would reduce the deficit by $400 billion over 10 years. The single loudest source of opposition, Council on Foundations, independent sector, and the organized charitable community, because if the donor gets 28 cents on the dollar rather than 35 or 39.6, at the margin there might be modestly less charitable contributions. There's a lot of analysis of this. The best estimates are the charitable contributions would probably go down by about 1.5 to 2%. I had an interesting discussion with the policy committee of the independent sector on this last week. The question I asked was, if you think of the various missions that nonprofits undertake, reducing hardship, reducing poverty, delivering basic services, education, arts, the environment. Take all those areas. Would the areas, would those missions and purposes, and even the budgets of nonprofits who get, in all those sectors, lots of government money through grants and aid, they administer money programs, would they be better off or worse off if their charitable contributions went down 2%, or if instead of getting the $400 billion that way, the federal government did $400 billion in deeper cuts in domestic programs? I think in most of these areas, even the budgets of many of the nonprofits would be lower because of the impact. $400 billion in cuts in programs, many of which, particularly services for various vulnerable people, are delivered through nonprofit providers. There's a related issue, which is a difficult one for the foundation and nonprofit sector. As I talked about in the meeting I was in last week, the question I asked was, why does the sector get up in arms if there's a proposal to cap itemized deductions of 28%, but be absolutely silent and not say a single word if there's a tax reform proposal that sets the top rate for high-income people at 28%. The incentive to give is identical under both approaches. One is much more aggressive. The other is attempting to avoid cuts in programs. So, but I don't think this is going to turn around until there begin to be powerful charities and foundations that push organizations like the Council on Foundations to take a little more enlightened position than they currently take on these issues. The second question is one that a couple of foundations, particularly the Hewlett Foundation, has approached us. I presume they're talking to other people as well about it in recent weeks. And I think it's a really important question. And it is, when you look over this whole budget picture, the conclusion, which is a conclusion most analysts, mainstream, even moderately conservative analysts, have drawn, every one of the fiscal commissions is drawn, that you really can't get to fiscal goals without really draconian effects, unless everything is on the table and you have contributions from both budget cuts and revenue increases. If you take what is often called a balanced approach. So the question Hewlett asked us was, if, for example, a number of major foundations were to be persuadable, what could foundations do to advance the cause of a balanced approach where everything, including revenues, is on the table? The issue is absolutely pivotal. We've actually seen this play out in a number of states, including this one, where, for example, various organizations, forgetting the name of the coalition in North Carolina, a group we work with called the North Carolina Budget Tax Center, has been heavily involved in this. We're in a debate, which is part of the Justice Center. The Justice Center is a parent organization. You can fill in more of the details than I, but I know there's this whole story of where all the policymakers started out saying it was going to be budget cuts only. All this work was done. In the end, there was a more balanced approach taken, and the cuts were much less severe. We need similar kinds of things at the state level, at the national level, and throughout many states. And I think these are the sorts of things that foundations that traditionally have never worked on fiscal policy, budget policy, tax policy, but that are saying every area we do work in is now at risk if there is an unbalanced approach at federal and state levels. I think there's a real important potential. And finally, there is this question about whether the philanthropy, through a combination of foundations, nonprofits, and religious leaders, could bring to a whole new level a core principle that deficit reduction needs to be done in ways that don't increase poverty or widen inequality. So I noted that the 90, 93, and 97 deficit reduction packages all got that passed. So did the 1985 Graham-Rubin-Hollings law, which set up across-the-board budget cuts if certain budget targets were missed and exempted the core low-income programs from the budget cuts. A feature that, at the White House's insistence, also appears in the Budget Control Act enacted last month. It triggers automatic cuts in January 2013 if certain things don't happen in the interim, and the core low-income programs are exempted from those cuts. It was noteworthy that when Bowles and Simpson came out with their plan last December, they had 4 or 5 core, or what they call guiding principles, and that deficit reduction should not increase poverty was one of their guiding principles. When the 6 senators in the Gang of 6 met from December through July and came out with the Gang of 6 plan in July, every time one of the senators, it didn't happen frequently, started trotting down the path towards a cut in food stamps or the earned income credit or whatever, the Bowles-Simpson principle was raised back up, particularly by Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. And in the end, the Gang of 6 plan essentially follows that principle as well. Both Bowles-Simpson and Gang of 6 shield all the basic low-income benefit programs from cuts, except Medicaid, which is a more complicated set of issues. And yet they do achieve each $4 trillion in deficit. In April of this year, a group of religious leaders from the Catholic Church to a number of Christian evangelical leaders and others formed together in what they call the Circle of Protection and issued a call, which they're now beginning to try to enlist more pastors around the country to join, that policymakers should draw a circle of protection around the core programs for low-income people in the United States. So there are these various threads starting, and this is not a battle, a policy debate that's going to be over by Thanksgiving, when the special joint committee is supposed to report its findings, which it may or may not succeed in doing. The magnitude of the fiscal issues are so large that we're going to be in this debate for a number of years. There are going to be tough decisions made over a number of years. And the outcome here is very much in doubt. Basically, it's which of the traditions is going to prevail, the 1993, 97, Bowles-Simpson circle of protection type principle and tradition, or 81, 96, and Ryan budget of 2011, where by the deepest and most disproportionate cuts would be made in programs for the poorest people in the United States. The outcome, I think, is extremely consequential, and it really goes beyond the numerical calculation of what's the dollar amount of a food stamp benefit or earned income credit amount that someone will get. It really goes to the heart of the question of what kind of a society what kind of country we're going to be. For all the people in the room who are students, probably most of you in your 20s, given life expectancies on average, you have 50, 60, 70 years of life ahead of you in this country. What's going to be the moral character of the country for the next 50, 60, 70 years? Are we going to be a country that, despite being the wealthiest in the world overall, has much higher levels of poverty, deep poverty, destitution, and inequality than almost any other Western industrialized nation. That's really what all these things come down to. So the stakes are high, and I think that also heightens the importance of efforts to figure out how philanthropy can play the most constructive role in leading us towards a fair outcome.
We're going to open up some Q&A.
If the argument is made that it could be damaging for the economy to eliminate all the Bush tax cuts tomorrow, I would totally agree. The economy is very weak right now. We have inadequate consumer demand, which leads to higher unemployment. And you wouldn't want to do a big tax increase right now while the economy is still weak. However, if we talk about after the economy has recovered, then I think that most of the argument that we referred to is either greatly overblown or pretty much without merit. Here's why. There have been a series of studies by mainstream economic institutions, the Congressional Budget Office, the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Congressional Research Service, Brookings, Urban Institute Tax Policy Center. Pretty much what they all find is that if you made the Bush tax cuts permanent without offsetting their cost, that because of the adverse effect on the economy of the kind of deficits we're looking at, that the net effect on the economy would actually be a negative. There would probably be some small adverse effect from having higher marginal tax rates, but that it would be more than outweighed by the adverse impact from having much larger deficits that soaked up more of the private capital, that left money available for new investment in plant and equipment, that could have effect on interest rates, and all of the above. I think there's a powerful argument that if someone were proposing going back to marginal income tax rates of 70 or 80 or 90%, you're going to have big dampening effects on entrepreneurial activity. It's hard to find strong and positive empirical effects on economic growth of having the top tax rate as we now do at 35% rather than at 39.6% as it was under Clinton before the Bush tax cuts. The point's often made, we've written a number of papers about this, that we had significant tax increases, raising the marginal rates at the top, in both 90, the deficit reduction package of 90 and 93. And then particularly when we got to 93, a lot of the people that make the arguments you referred to predicted there would be devastating effects on the economy. We did big tax cuts with big reductions in marginal rates in 01 and 03, and the prediction was we'd have an economic boom. If you compare the 90s to the aughts, and you look at about 7 different basic economic metrics, real GDP, average annual real GDP growth, fixed investment, employment growth, et cetera, et cetera. On every one, the 90s either outperformed or equally performed the aughts. The only one where the aughts did better was corporate profits. There's yet another factor here where the argument out of basic economic one theory is made and is certainly valid. Well, the lower the tax rate, the more of each dollar you earn you get to keep, so the incentive to work more. But as economists often argue, there's a second basic principle that goes the other way. If for each dollar you earn, you keep a little less of it, because the tax rate is higher, then if you have a certain income goal, you have to work more hours to get to that income goal. So there's this debate in the economic literature of, how these two factors outweigh each other. I do think there is agreement across the political spectrum that if you had two alternative ways of raising revenue, and one was simply raising the marginal tax rates, and the other was not raising the rates, maybe even lowering a little bit if you could, and broadening the base, getting rid of a lot of the deductions, credits, exclusions. I don't think there's any dispute, and I would certainly agree, that the second approach would be economically preferable to the first approach. But, after the economy is able to take it, simply having marginal tax rates, at most at the top about 5 points higher than they were before. I think it's hard to find a big effect. And in particular, if it contributes to deficit reduction substantially, it's more likely to be a net positive than a net negative for economic growth over the long run.
I'm a little surprised at the figure that you gave on the effect the tax revenue saved by reducing the charitable deduction to 28%. The reason Charlie Topfeder sitting here is more of an expert than I am on this, but according to the figures that I've seen from the Joint Tax Committee, the Joint Economic Committee, the total cost of the charitable deduction, this is the total for all deductions, is about somewhere, it's been somewhere around $45 to $50 billion. So how does how does lowering the cap to 28% create $400 billion over 10 years? I don't see it, because that would be it would be the reduction, it would have to remove the whole deduction, the cost of the deduction.
The question is useful because sometimes in the charitable community, people see the Obama proposal as only affecting the charitable. Of the $400 billion, probably less than $100 billion of it comes from the charity. The $400 billion is the sum of the effects on the mortgage interest deduction, pension credits, charitable, the state and local tax deduction, breaks for interest on certain kinds of bonds. I mean, it is a comprehensive proposal that covers all sorts of things.
I understood you attribute it to the charitable deduction, but in fact, if you include all of those other deductions, then I understand.
Yes, the $400 billion is all. Right. The charitable maybe accounts for a quarter of the total savings, maybe a little less, a little more, probably less.
And if I remember correctly, I don't know whether go ahead.
I left out one key point.
Right.
I screwed up here. I left out one key point. The proposal we're talking about, well, maybe this is implicit in what I said, but the proposal only applies, cap at 28%, only applies to people who make over $250 million a year, and individuals over $200,000. Now, most people below that are in a 28% or below bracket anyway, but it's only targeted on people.
Does the operation of the tax deduction with the cap at 28% affect such other? The largest tax expenditures, that I understand it, really is the largest one is the employer provided health benefits, and I'm just wondering. That strikes me as not really being included in this.
So I have to get back to you with the answer on that. The original Obama proposal saved about $300 million. It only applied to itemized deductions. It didn't apply to any exclusions. The new proposal, which came out September 19th, a week ago Monday, is broader. I'm not sure I think it does in some way affect and actually I remember, I should have read it more carefully, there's a memo on this from one of the tax experts on our staff. And it does affect the employer exclusion in some way, but I'm afraid I don't know it well enough yet. But the way they got from 300 billion to 400 billion, the new version of the proposal, is to extend it to begin to touch some of the exclusions and not only the only which I think makes it a better deal. Having said that, what are the odds that this proposal will go anywhere? 0. It's really pretty much dead on the line. You know, it's very interesting. The Bowles-Simpson proposal gets praised to the skies in the abstract. When you looked at how did they lower the rates, the top tax rates into the 20s and still get $1 trillion in savings? And there are no specifics there. There is an illustrative plan, but it was labeled illustrative so that the members of the Bowles-Simpson Commission who wanted to vote for the plan could vote for it and say, well, I didn't really vote for that. And when you look at the illustrative plan, you know, it's kind of like a tax policy wonks dream, but, you know, I don't know if you can get 10 members of either party to vote for it. So it like turns the mortgage interest deduction into a 12% tax credit. So everybody in the, you know, if you go into higher brackets, it would be worth much, much less. It taxes capital gains of debt. I mean, it has all these things that a lot of us have long thought would be great policy, but, you know, you can't find a liberal Democrat that would talk to you about it, let alone a Republican. So it's very, you know, it's sort of the concept of, this gets back to the first question, the concept of don't do the rates, broaden the base. It's the right policy and it sounds great, but once you start the mortgage interest deduction, the charitable deduction, the employer exclusion, once you actually get into where the substantial money is on the tax expenditure side, it is hard as nails to do anything to scale any of them.
The $1 billion a year, I'm sorry, the $1 trillion a year figure that you used covers all of these things. That is, in terms of tax expenditures.
Oh, that $1 trillion?
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is basically a joint tax committee figure with a caveat. If you add up every one of the individual tax expenditures and every one of the corporate tax expenditures, the total is a little over $1 trillion, as the chart indicates. Now, in the real world, there are interactions between them, so the actual figure might be modestly lower or modestly higher. It's not analytically feasible to know what the actual figure is when you would consider all the interactions.
You had a question here.
I think it's okay here because it's along the same line. So I'm interested in this.
Say who you
Oh,
are.
hi, I'm Danielle Vance. I'm a first-year PhD student here. And I'm interested in this idea that you went and talked to the independent sector about the nonprofit sector's opposition to the 28% cap. And I think it sounds really good on the surface that basically you're saying, you know, give us this loophole closure, give us the 1 or 2% of donations that will cost you, and what you gain from it is $400 billion back, in much greater dollar amount back in the federal budget, right? Because you're the only real opposition among all these loopholes is you guys. And then I think you said that what that gets us is $400 billion back in social programs. But I guess my skepticism of Washington is that what that gets us is $400 billion back for somebody. And it may let something like expiring the Bush-era tax cuts off the hook when, or, you know, that's the part I was skeptical about. And then I wonder if you could say a little more about that.
Yeah, well, I guess I didn't give a very good description of what I was saying to the independent sector because As I said to them, this idea of 2% versus the 400 billion, I said this is a thought experiment. Of course, it isn't exactly how it would work. The larger point that I was making was that they've been more vocal on opposing that than other tax proposals that have the same effect. And if, in the interest of protecting charitable contributions, they're going to raise their voice against that proposal on the itemized deduction, then it is incumbent upon them to find other revenue-raising measures that they support the concept of a balanced approach, and that they lend their voices to efforts to, like, have deficit reduction not increase poverty. There's no way they can, if independent sector said we're going to support the Obama proposal, a lot of their members would disenroll. Institutionally, they can't do it, and I wasn't asking them to do it. I was trying to utilize it to say, if that's all one focuses on, it's too myopic even in the interest of the sector. And I was using the 400 billion as a thought experiment to try to advance the point. And to their credit, the speaker after me was someone, was Gene Sterling of the Urban Institute, who's doing work and was presenting to them alternative options that could try to modify how the tax code deals with charitable contributions in ways that could raise revenue without lowering contributions. And I very much commended them. First, I said, you don't like this one, fine. You gotta find something else before. But more importantly is the need for a much broader base of stakeholders to be calling for the broad approach where everything, including revenues in general, is on the table. That is something that the leadership of the independent sector completely agrees with. The difficulty the leadership has is that some of their member organizations, and they'll candidly tell you this, have boards with very wealthy donors who do not want the organization to ever say a word about revenues. And that's really the heart of the dilemma for independent sector.
Yeah, Dan Gerlach with the Golden Leaf Foundation. The argument from the right here locally on the federal issue is that right now federal spending is about 25% of GDP, round numbers. Revenues are 15% of GDP, round numbers. The problem with revenues is that will come back when the economy comes back up to its more natural historic level. The spending will come back down. The spending won't come back down because Obama's just going to spend us to oblivion, right? And so that's the thing here, is that what has happened is that the spending has gone up too fast. The revenues are going to come back if you do nothing, if the economy recovers, if we just get rid of this wasteful stimulus and all that. So that's arguments. Could you talk a little bit about where that historical balance is? And the second point I would make, you're brave. First of all, to support you wearing that Carolina blue tie on this campus. And the third point, and I'll hush that. I think that the independent sector has stepped up on the estate tax,
Yes.
on the effects of the estate tax on philanthropy in general, so we're not altogether silent on it or kind of complacent on the issues, despite some donors on my board who might not.
Let me take the last issue first. I used to be beyond appalled at independent sector when in 2001 it didn't say a damn word about a repeal of the estate tax. It actually was completely chicken, and so was the Council of Foundations. And we at the Center, we're members of independent sector now, and we joined because Diana and others changed the policy and they became quite vocal on the estate tax. I thought that was terrific.
As happened here in this state, where we kept a separate tax for a long, long time, thanks to support of Justice Center and others. But the philanthropies were there too.
I've not really seen the Council on Foundations be quite equivalent in its activity on the estate tax. Historical issues. So you're absolutely right. This is the core of the presentation. It's totally a spending problem because after the economy recovers, revenues will go back to their historic level of 18 to 18.5% of GDP.
Right.
Spending will be higher, therefore we've just proved that the whole thing is a spending. Now, apart from the fact, if I can get all the way back, I thought I turned this off, I'm sorry. Apart from the fact of what this chart shows of the big contributions since 2001, the more fundamental point, which I think now actually lots of policymakers, at least Democrats, in Washington understand is the result of something that's happened in the last 6 months, is that the historical analogies are really not apt or applicable and really just serve ideological purposes and are not meaningful as good analysis. What illustrated this was that there was a bill introduced in April that would permanently cap federal spending at 20.6% of GDP, and it said this is the historical average. The problem with the historical averages, apart from the fact that the historical average level of revenue, a little over 18%, hasn't been enough to avoid deficits in virtually every year. And the only year we've actually balanced the budgets have been years where revenues were up generally in the 20 to 21% of GDP range, like the late 90s. But apart from that, the historical average figures use averages from, say, 1970 through 2008. That's not the world we live in anymore. In those decades, the elderly were a much smaller percentage of the population than they're going to be in the decades ahead. The elderly are going from about 13% of the population today to 20% by, I forget, 2030, 2025, 2030. They were lower. Healthcare costs are not what they used to be. Healthcare costs throughout, this isn't a government thing, throughout the healthcare system, they're much higher than they were in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we spent virtually zero on Homeland Security. We only started spending a lot after the September 11th attack. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars, even if they were to end totally tomorrow, there are big expenditures for the next 50 years for health care for veterans from the wars. So we have all of these, and as a result of, if you look at the bottom blue, economic downturn, why in 2019 is there such a big contribution to deficits, to spending from the economic downturn? It isn't going to be over by then. Yes, but it had such a big impact while it was going on that the debt is so much larger as a result of this huge downturn that we're forever going to have to be paying interest payments on the debt that the worst recession since the Great Depression visited upon us. So because of all of those things, you can't make the historic levels work. The Ryan budget, with the really draconian cuts that I showed, the Ryan budget 10 years from now has spending at around 20.5% of GDP, the historical average level. Yet it has these draconian cuts. Why? You can't make the old numbers work anymore. Aging of the population, accumulated debt and interest costs, higher healthcare costs. So I was actually, this is one of the positive stories in Washington this year. I was extremely worried in April that this idea of capping federal spending at the historic average of 20.6% of GDP would pass. There was a period of about 3 or 4 weeks when the mainstream media was describing it as a likely outcome of the debt ceiling negotiation. And over the course of a couple of months, and Democratic senators were starting to sign up as co-sponsors. And over the course of a couple of months, this striking education of at least the Democratic members of Congress occurred, where almost all of them ended up coming to see that you would decimate all kinds of key things if you tried to live for decades to come at the historic averages from the past. It even got to the point that the lead Democratic co-sponsor of the bill to cap spending at 20.6% of GDP got up in a closed-door Senate Democratic caucus lunch and said, I'm on the bill, it has my name on it, I'm the original co-sponsor. I now understand the effects of it better. I do not recommend that any of my colleagues join me as a co-sponsor. This is not the usual sort of thing. But, you know, here was something where the sound bite seemed powerful. And the reasonable analysis of where it led to actually persuaded policymakers, especially senators, a lot of senators, to move away from it. So it went from being predicted as something that had a good chance of passing to something that couldn't. But I don't mean to minimize the point. You really put your finger on, I am sure that we're going to hear the point you just raised about 50,000 times in the 2012 campaign. In fact, Mitt Romney has a centerpiece of his platform as of 2 or 3 weeks ago, permanently cap federal spending at 20.0% of GDP, which is actually below this time. So this is going, I think this is actually going to be a central theme in the campaign, and I think it will be challenging. Obama is going to have to articulate and explain to the country, if Romney's the nominee, why the historical average analogy, for example, isn't the right way for the country to go. And that's going to be a big challenge for him or anybody to actually convince people.
Donna, did you have a question?
Now I know why people vote against their economic self-interest, because it's complicated. And it's a lot easier to vote on these other things. So I was just thinking, as I'm knocking on doors, trying to talk to people about voting, what do I say? Like, what do I say that makes this understandable? I work here. I'm just a working person. And how do I just make this point in a way that a working person could even understand it?
So let me preface what I'm about to say. People who know me well, I'm not a particularly political or partisan person, and I've often been disappointed in President Obama's reluctance to articulate some of these things. But if you listen to his speech on September 19th, you know, so he took this, when he crystallized it in his budget, his new budget proposes increased out-of-pocket costs for ordinary seniors for Medicare to help reduce the cost. It's not just for high income people. But he said, even though I'm proposing this, I will veto any bill that raises Medicare costs for seniors if it does not also ask the richest people in the country and the biggest corporations to pay their fair share. If it lets them off scot-free, they don't share in the sacrifice, it doesn't touch a single loophole. And I think that kind of message resonates. And, you know, I do more of these charts and policy law kind of stuff. But I think when one, I think the average person, the idea that those forces that can afford to hire expensive K Street lobbyists in Washington and really, the Warren Buffett thing, the idea that those people at the top of the income scale who get the majority of their income from capital gains or dividends should pay a smaller percentage of their multi-million-dollar income in taxes than teachers or secretaries or, pick your. I think that resonates with people. That doesn't sound right to people. So I do think that the argument that we should all be in this together and that everybody has to contribute. And that means we have to look at particularly some of the special tax breaks for people at the top of the income scale and big corporations. I think that is a winning message, not a losing message.
I'm going to ask a quick question, and we'll take a couple more, and then we'll break. Almost the other side of what Donna was saying. I'm sure there were a number of people who were very surprised by the response that Rand Paul gave last week in the debate when he was asked about a person who couldn't buy health insurance, blah, blah, and now the person's dying.
Let it buy.
And the response was, let it buy. We have churches, and I forgot the exact quote, I had it at one point, but churches and other institutions who are there to take care of him, meaning, I suppose, nonprofit organizations, and therefore it's not our responsibility, or something like that. I wonder if you could give a sense of how does that point of view resonate within the halls of Congress and lobbyists and so forth? Is it really as draconian and cowboy stuff as that?
I don't know really at all any of the Tea Party freshmen in the House. The kinds of, not just Democrats, but the kinds of people who used to be the Republican leaders and whom we used to work closely with, the Bob Doles and the Howard Bakers and people like that, they all would have been appalled at the vote price. I don't think that would be the majority view of Congress. It reminded me, I remember the period in the early 80s when we were having another one of our endless battles over whether there should be food stamp cuts. Again, Jesse Helms is the chairman of the Ag Committee to seek food stamp cuts, and some group, I don't remember which one, found an extraordinarily sympathetic witness. I don't remember all the details. It was a hardworking guy, and the vicissitudes of life had hit him. It was no fault of his own, and now his family couldn't put food on the table, and they really needed food stamps, and they would be directly hit by the cuts Helms was proposing, and the guy was the emotionally wrenching witness. And when he finished, you could like have heard a pin drop. Everybody wanted, wait, how's Helms going to respond? And Helms got this look of big compassion on his face, and he walked over to the guy. He said, your church can help. I can talk to your pastor. Who's your pastor? It was interesting.
Deja vu, all over again. We'll take Leslie and then Pat, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'm Leslie Benner from the Eastern Trials Foundation. And I'm very interested in your view of the role of philanthropy in helping this debate come to a good conclusion. With some great difficulty, I'm able to imagine how state and local funders can help the state resolve its own current and long-term budget deficits in a way that is more progressive and less regressive. But it's very hard for me to imagine or to understand how state and local funders really can have an impact on national debate?
Well, there are state and local funders that have varying levels of assets. But in general, and I'm going to greatly oversimplify here, but in general, if one thinks of the national foundations as by and large being the ones with the much bigger, some national foundations, as being the ones with the much bigger assets. I think in many cases, it indeed is appropriate for state and local funders to particularly focus on these battles at the state and local level. In fact, I would note that one of the clear takeaways from all of these numbers is substantial budget cuts are coming. They're coming. We're talking about how far they go. Even if, and I worry that the political environment today is pretty different than it was in 1993 and 97, and in particular the Republican Party is pretty different than it was then. And, you know, people like Bob Dole are among our closest allies, right? But even if there is success in protecting core low-income programs, just thinking of the cuts that will come in the discretionary programs. 1/3 of all federal discretionary funding is in the form of grants and aid to state and local governments. Even to my consternation, the Obama administration has in its new budget about $40 billion of cost shifts to states in the Medicaid program. So states are going to be the recipients of pain, and they will then be left to make decisions on what to do with it. And let me order, you know, if it should happen that the Republicans hold the House of Representatives in 2012, which most political forecasters expect they will, also take the Senate, which most political forecasters give them a better than 50-50 chance of doing, and also win the White House. 50-50, whatever. Let's suppose all three of those things happen. If all three of those happened, I would give about a 75 or 80% probability to the Medicaid program being converted to a block grant to the states. Food stamps into a block grant, I'm less sure, maybe. The point being that the realm of decision-making at the state level and how it affects people of lesser means is going to become far more important than it already is. Because, yes, hopefully the economy will recover and states will get out of the current revenue crisis, but there are going to be major federal cuts that affect state budgets, and there's a potential for, you know, the beauty, if you're Paul Ryan, the beauty of getting these massive savings from Medicaid and food stamps through block grants is you don't ever have to put out a specific proposal. When Ronald Reagan, in the second year in '82, he had these huge food stamp cuts. We had a field. We could show how it would affect the elderly widow. They weren't. The proposals aren't that way anymore. The states would have to figure out how to do the cuts. So I think it is, you know, for the organizations that work on this in the states, on average, they really have very modest budgets given the battles. And I think, as I say, those battles are probably going to get a lot more consequential. So for state and local funders that don't have really big resources, I think it's appropriate to let the national funders deal with the national issues I'm talking about, and to take as part of the mission for one if one's a state funder, thinking about the fallout at the state level for the national decisions and the whole new set of policy decisions that state policymakers are going to have to make as more and more of these federal policy decisions come down and shove both some of the financial pain and a lot of the really gruesome policy choices on how to actually get the money they're going to dump them on the street.
I have to say that somehow I don't find that answer very comforting.
Matt? I'm Patrick Sable. I'm a recent Stanford graduate and I work in international trade finance. In the short term, well, right now I feel like Republicans' hands are tied in a lot of ways. They've signed Road Northwest pledges, they've got angry constituents, they can't push a lot of different agendas, even if they might personally believe in something. In the short term, is there any way that kind of centrists can push forward in the conservative movement to actually responsibly move the budget? Is it a branding issue? You talked a lot about talking about, removing loopholes, getting rid of that, cleaning up the tax code. Do you see a pragmatic path forward for them where they can actually avoid this really hard push to the right?
So, there's all the Philistine stuff. I mean, what was really interesting was that Tom Coburn, who's one of the most conservative senators, was part of Bull Simpson on the Gang of Six. And there was a very public spat between Coburn and Grover Norquist. Norquist said, you're signing on tax increases, and Coburn basically said, raising tax rates is a tax increase. Curbing spending in the tax code isn't. Then there was this funny episode several months ago when a proposal that lots of Republicans, to their credit, favored to scale back the pretty egregious federal tax subsidy for ethanol was on the Senate floor. And, a lot of Republican senators, somehow it didn't get portrayed as this is violating the pledge. So I do think that there are openings there on the tax expenditure side. And the fact that, Tom Coburn could do that is really encouraging. Now, when the Republican leaders went to name I should say this about Democratic leaders as well. When the Republican and Democratic leaders went to name members to this new joint committee that's supposed to recommend $1.5 trillion deficit reduction by November, it was noted that both Senator McConnell and Senator Reid, the Democratic and Republican and Democratic Senate leaders, both passed over all of the senators who had been on Bull Simpson and Gang of Six and voted for him, all of whom, to some degree, had irritated, ruffled various members of their own caucuses by what they did. I was in mourning that Dick Durbin wasn't one of the people that Harry Reid named, and for a while it looked like he was going to be. And I don't think Durbin was not. This is a long story, and it has to do with the Chuck Schumer, Dick Durbin politics. I don't think it primarily has to do with Bill Simpson, but I won't go into all of that. But Durbin is kind of like among all these people is my hero right now, because he went in, and I was wrong. At the very end, Durbin was trying to decide whether to vote for or against Bull Simpson, and I was looking at the very badly designed, I think, Bull Simpson now agree. In retrospect, it was not well designed. The Social Security component of their proposal. And on balance, I recommended that you vote against it. And one of the key reasons he voted for it was he said, this is going to be the start of something, and I want to be in the room. And I said to him about 5 times since then, you were right, I was totally wrong on my advice. So he worked really hard to get $4 trillion in savings, to really protect low-income people, to make sure that when the tax reforms brought the rates lower, the rates were done, that they'd be done in a progressive manner. I mean, in theory, you could do a tax reform that was pretty appalling. You could lower rates primarily at the top, and instead of looking at things like preferential rates for capital gains or dividends, you could eviscerate the earned income tax credit for the working poor. That's a tax expenditure. You could eliminate the low-income housing tax credit. So Durbin got agreement on the Gang of Six that there'd be a fundamental principle while they weren't spelling out the details on how to broaden the base and lower the rates, that it had to be done in a way that the overall net effect maintained the progressivity, maintained or increased the progressivity of the tax bill. And Coburn and Craybill went along, and Shambles went along with it. So, you know, the question is how, and I suspect, you know, it's not that I have real firm knowledge of this, but I suspect that there are a number of other Republican members of Congress who privately agree with that approach. The difficulty they face is the risk of having the Tea Party run a primary vote against it. I mean, the effect on Republicans in Washington of the Utah Senate race when Bob Benner, an extremely well-respected, rock-ribbed conservative, but, you know, not crazy, well-respected, not Ron Paul, Rand Paul, Jim DeMint, you know, very conservative, not a moderate, but not in any way extreme, kooky, whatever. And, you know, he was knocked off in the primary by this Tea Party guy, Mike Lee. You know, so you have people like Olympia Snowe of Maine, who used to be more liberal than a number of Democrats in the Senate, now co-sponsoring extreme right-wing legislation, not because I think she believes in it, but because she's up in 2012 and the Tea Party in Maine has already threatened to run a primary challenger. So I think it's going, until we get to the point where for a number of Republican lawmakers, they are more worried about a potential primary challenge from the right than about the general election. Until we get past that episode, it's going to be very difficult. And how long it will take to change that, I have no idea. I mean, this Tea Party thing is like kind of nowhere. I mean, it's very rapid and it's very intense. It really is. You know, I think, depending on how long it lasts, but I think this will get significant attention 50, 100 years from now in history books. It's really having a real outsized effect on, you know, the whole thing where we almost went up to the brink and had a default. You know, Boehner and even Eric Kent, who panders to the Tea Party, I mean, they didn't want a default, but they would start to move in a certain direction, and the Tea Party freshmen on the caucus would go crazy. So, you know, the new theory of government by hostage taking is that we didn't used to do things that way. It's a major issue. I've sometimes over the years, you know, I'd be in some discussion and somebody would say to me, well, isn't the key to good policy having lots more Democrats win elections? And I sometimes say, actually, the most important development would be if people like, you know, the Bob Doles and the Howard Bakers were running the Republican Party again, and you could actually do bipartisan compromises. But of course, what happens is the polarization also means there are hardly any moderate Republicans left. They've been replaced by Democrats in the areas they were from, just as a lot of the most conservative Southern Democrats either were defeated by Republicans or became Republicans. So, you know, there's a, there are political scientists in the room, you know this better than I, but there's an analysis, I can't remember who did it, where they sort of looked at voting patterns in the Congress. And, you know, it was sort of like, how many Republicans used to vote more liberal than the conservative group of Democrats, how many Democrats used to vote, you know, there was a certain amount of overlap. When you look at the voting patterns now, there's almost total separation, particularly on key fiscal policy issues. But you don't have any of this anymore. And it's, you know, it goes beyond all the budget stuff we're talking about. We're really getting to the question of whether our political institutions can function. You know, I've been in Washington 40 years. I've never seen anything like this. You know, I mean, the government isn't going to shut down right now, but the idea that we almost had an impasse over a few $2 billion in disaster relief. This used to be a non-issue. Everybody would agree, you know, you have hurricane, it's kind of amazing. So there, you know, underlying everything else is the question of the viability of the political institutions themselves.
Thank you.
Wow, well, chastening, immensely important conversation. Thank you on behalf of all of us here very much. We have our next FIRG in 3 weeks, and thank you all for coming and getting a booster shot.